Welcome to episode 12 of Running on OCP, where we speak with organizations using open compute in a variety of ways, including end users, software companies, and other organizations who align to the OCP tenets. This week, I moved to the Baltics, where we discuss one of the largest infrastructure projects to take place there in the last 100 years. And I'm talking about Rail Baltica, which is a greenfield new transport rail system that's going to integrate those Baltic states. 5 different European countries, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Finland are involved in the project. Joining me is Andy Billington, who's an innovation and sustainability specialist within the project. And throughout the entire conversation, Andy does a great job of getting you to think about all the complexities as well as the opportunities in such a project this size. I really enjoyed my conversation with Andy, and I hope you do too. Enjoy this week's episode of Running on OCP with Andy Billington from Rail Baltica. Andy, thanks for joining me today.
No problem, Steve. Good to be here.
So, Andy, what is Rail Baltica?
So it's a greenfield railway project linking Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania to the northeastern corner of Europe into the main European transport network. So it'll be the first 1435mm first standard gauge railway in the region, and it will bring not just the rail connectivity, but also wider benefits, more of an economic corridor than just a railway.
And so is this your background? Do you have a background in rail, or how did you get involved in this?
Originally, my background is IT, networking and data centers, and I started to become more involved in troubleshooting and eventually into data analytics, and that drew me into a railway project in the UK. And after a few years there, this opportunity came up.
And so now this is, just to be clear, this is a brand new greenfield railway system. This is not an update to a current railroad system, is that correct?
Yeah, this is completely new, complete greenfield.
Must be a huge advantage in some areas to start fresh without legacy infrastructures. Is that safe to say?
It's an advantage. It's also at times a challenge because you have every system has to be delivered. It's not a case of you're upgrading some systems, you're integrating with some existing system, everything has to be delivered. On the plus side, it means that everything can be delivered using the most appropriate modern technology rather than integrating with rail systems which perhaps in some cases may have been in use for 5, 10, 20 or 30 years.
And how are you approaching technology, and how are you thinking through the technology when it comes to this project? I've seen in the past where you've made comparisons to the 5G rollouts in areas, but talk through your thoughts on the technology pieces.
So there are a few different aspects to consider, and it's important to keep them separate. One of the things is obviously railways are critical infrastructure, they're safety critical systems. So that is a separate area. It has a lot of regulations. There are a lot of rules about, for example, the safety integrity level of signaling. So you will see formal methods being deployed to mathematically prove systems are safe. In those areas, the scope for innovation is there, but obviously it's constrained, and it should be in safety. But in other areas, there are things where newer technologies and newer approaches can be used. So we can look at modular approaches rather than one size fits all or one-stop shop solutions. We can look at disaggregation. And one of the comparisons with 5G is if you think of the railway infrastructure as a straight line network, perhaps the comparison is an edge node in 5G terms could be equipment at the side of the track that's doing sensors, that's monitoring that particular set of track, and the equipment that you could deploy to do that could be the same equipment that you would deploy at a 5G base station.
And so you have all the sensors, you have the edge, what is called basically ruggedized or micro data centers that would then be sitting in different areas along the track. And this must take quite a new and innovative way of thinking when you talk about disaggregation. So how do you see open source fitting into the way that you're thinking through the technology, both open source software and open source hardware?
Again, there's a few things that I probably should comment on. The key thing is to look at open interfaces and open specifications. That doesn't mean we're not looking at open source. Obviously, if you have open interfaces, open specifications, there is a really good chance that the first deployment or the first prototypes will be open source from any kind of spec. And also, one of the things we have to keep in mind is the area that I'm working on is developing a lab, developing proofs of concept, evaluating, demonstrating what's possible. That's a lot easier in a lab environment with open source than it might be with a proprietary solution, especially when you consider that the actual railway deployment will be based around public procurement and tendering regulations, which make it harder. If, for example, in the lab we showed something working but using a proprietary component, how do you know that that particular supplier doesn't get an advantage in the public procurement? So that it gives us, using open source hardware and software and those open interfaces, gives us a lot more flexibility. So there are a lot of things that we can probably explore more easily than it would otherwise be possible to do.
And so how does this work with, say, the traditional way of doing rail communication systems and some of the thoughts around the new railway communication systems that you may have mentioned in the past?
I think the biggest change will be that the new communication system, which is called FOMCS, the Future Railway Mobile Communication System, is based around 3GPP standards. So the previous system was GSMR, which is obviously a GSM-based solution, but it was a variation of GSM that was made specifically for the railways, and that had a few impacts. The first is it reduced the number of potential suppliers because you had to have railway-specific hardware, not just specific frequency bands, but specific hardware features. And in FOMCS, there is a deliberate alignment with the 3GPP standards process. And these are European standards, so the ETSI standardization process as well. And the intention is to keep as close as possible to the 3GPP standards. And where there are variations, it'll be software that is on top of the standard. That obviously opens up the scope for all of the other areas of those standards. Other equipment that is compliant with that standard, as long as it meets any safety requirement for a particular application, can be looked at.
And so you think that this opens up then the breadth of participation to, say, even SMEs compared to, say, traditional legacy players?
I think on the telecoms side, on the mobile comms particularly, it's quite hard to see SME opportunities. But if you look at the data, the analytics, and standardizing all of the interfaces for things like the sensors at the side of the track, or even new sensors at the side of the track, the opportunities are there for SMEs and for AI, for machine learning algorithms. If the data are all standardized, if it's all collected on standard platforms where almost anybody can actually download the standard, look at it, and do a proof of concept of their idea. And then we hopefully will have the lab environment set up in such a way that people can come along and put their innovation into a test environment.
So almost a community approach without necessarily being a formalized community in that way.
Yes, you could describe it like that, yes.
Yeah. So this sounds like a massive undertaking, a brand new railway across 3 different countries. What have been some of the biggest challenges so far?
I think you've just described them. It's a massive undertaking. It is across 3 different countries, so that we have to standardize approaches. We also have different organizations involved. So the company that I work for is the overall coordinator. We have an implementing body in each of the 3 countries, which looks after the actual delivery within that country. We also are funded from the European Union's Connecting Europe facility. So there are quite a lot of interfaces with that program that we need to manage as well. And that's a positive in some ways, because it opens up the access to the wider market, and it opens up the lessons learned from other Connecting Europe funded projects.
Now, this is one of the most interesting parts of the project to me, is when I've read some of your content and how you've positioned sustainability as a core tenet of the way that you're going to approach this project, and sustainability around everything that you're going to do along the way. So talk about sustainability and what that means to you, say versus efficiency, and the overall viewpoint of how that fits into the strategy.
There are a lot of things that people call sustainability, which perhaps are, but you have to kind of step back and look at the bigger picture as well. So, for example, rail is one of the most sustainable forms of transport there is. Trying to persuade people to use the railway instead of, for example, a truck might show up as an environmental benefit, but to get that argument across, it has to be nearly as easy to use the railway as it is to drive a truck. Obviously, there are more infrastructure concerns around with the railway. You have to have somewhere where the train can be loaded with those trucks. But to make the offer as attractive as possible to the ultimate owner of the goods, you have to have the digital integration. So innovation and digitalization of rail is also an aspect of sustainability. Persuading people to use the more sustainable transport method is only possible if we are adopting sort of the newest technologies. We're also looking at, what about energy usage? Obviously, the IT and data center sectors use a great deal of energy, but transport is up there too. Actually, transport is higher. One of the things that we're currently looking and studying is it going to be possible to power the whole railway from renewable sources only? And that's, as you can probably imagine, that's quite a challenge. It might be the case that we can do that for the trains that are electrified. Our whole infrastructure will be electrified. The trains that are designed for running on our new infrastructure will be electrified, but there's a possibility that there will be non-electrified trains that come into the infrastructure from other countries. So how do you cope with those kind of things? And how do you make the overall picture as attractive and as sustainable as possible? Obviously, the sustainability goal.
Yeah, well, just now, I mean, when you're talking about that, about saying, well, we can contain and we can account for everything that we're in charge of, but when you have third parties coming in and using that infrastructure, how do they fit into your standards and what you have in plan? And sounds like another very, very intense variable. Now, as we look at the hardware piece, you've started to test a few pieces of OCP hardware. Talk a little bit about how you've put that together in your lab.
Yeah, we have 4 nodes at the moment, and that will hopefully grow over the rest of 2021. We're also looking at Sonic or Stratum-based switches. So while there isn't an explicit intention to only look at open source, as I mentioned, one of the things that we have to consider is future public procurements and making sure that we don't inadvertently do something that's based on one particular manufacturer's technology or product. So one of the safest, or from my point of view, one of the safest ways to approach that is to make sure that you don't have anything that is standardized under one manufacturer's control.
And having that open procurement process, we see more and more organizations looking at an open source mindset when they issue RFPs. We've seen RFPs now explicitly asking for open type of designs. And I foresee more of that coming, especially here in Europe, a little bit more forward thinking when it comes to that.
I think you'll also see some interesting development over the next couple of years with, under the framework of the European Green Deal, people will be pushed to look at or maybe not pushed, but it certainly will be in people's minds that they should look at the efficiency of the equipment that they're buying and not just PUE. PUE was a good metric when it was introduced because it replaced nothing. But at the moment, there are other things to think about as well. What materials are used? Do you have more plastic than you need to? If you are going to have to use plastic, is it recyclable? And all those considerations should be coming into play as well, not just is it energy efficient.
Yeah, so the embodied or scope 3 emissions when it comes to your infrastructure. That's great. And we're really focused a lot on that as well. I'm sure that those in the community are aware of all the initiatives we have around sustainability and driving those scope 3 emissions metrics and measurements. So Andy, what is next for Rail Baltica in the next few months here?
Over the next few months, we're assembling the lab, we're bringing more equipment in. We're hoping to establish a more flexible testing environment so we can, where we can't have a completely supplier neutral approach, we can support multiple suppliers for the same components. So for example, RFID readers, we'll get them from multiple sources. And then part of our task will be to do the integration and to show our stakeholders that actually you can use standards to say, we want this particular reader to work in this way. After that, we're looking at some more projects which will come up over the next couple of years. The timeline overall is to have services from 2026 onwards. So we will have some big milestone public procurements over the next, I think, 2 to 3 years. People will see some large-scale procurements, things like the railway signalling system. They're obviously very big projects. There are lots of construction works coming up, as you can probably imagine. The other thing that's interesting when you look at sort of what's happened over the last year is connectivity has become more and more important. Not just the physical railway, but also digital connectivity. And I think that's one of the areas that we spoke about quite a long time ago, is because you're putting in the new infrastructure, you can also put in digital infrastructure. So we can put in fiber along the side of the railway to support non-rail users, to support connectivity for rural areas where perhaps a mobile operator's business case isn't what it could be. Or maybe some neutral host infrastructure can help there. And the incremental cost of putting in the fiber compared with the cost of putting in the railway is relatively small. And I think that those kind of things become possible. And
yeah, and I would anticipate as you go through this project over the next few years, there may be even new business models that arise from all of these new technologies that the rail might not even be thinking about at this particular time.
Yes, and one of the key things will be to make sure that the infrastructure is designed to be flexible enough to support whatever's coming. And I think one of the things that people may overlook when you compare sort of IT and telecom sector with rail infrastructure, think about the life cycle of the assets. A railway track is designed to last 50, 60 years, not 50 or 60 months. And there are railways in the world, and you're in London, I lived in London a long time, Transport for London, there are parts of the tube network which have been operating for over 150 years. Those kind of things, that mindset is very different, but it doesn't mean that there aren't lessons to be learned in both directions.
That's very true. The lifespan of those assets that span on the railway it's got to be some of the longest in any sector, from 50 to 100 years all the way to 50 to 60 months, depending on the IT. Yeah. Well, Andy, it's one of the more fascinating projects that's happening in Europe, and I've really enjoyed watching the progress over the last 18 to 24 months and look forward to seeing what the next 2 years brings. So I'll be back with my key takeaways from my conversation with Andy in just a minute. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed my conversation today with Andy. Just so many interesting points about this entire project, from the sheer size and complexity of it, putting in a brand new rail system across 5 countries. One is around this new future railway communication system and how that's going to open the door for a lot of open source and open designs to participate in a project like this. And the second is, how do you balance between sustainability in some areas, in some countries, where other countries may not be as sustainable, and how do you accommodate for both of those moving forward? And lastly is the new opportunities and the new business models that can come from putting in a brand new rail system around laying fiber next to the track, cloud services, ruggedized environments. All of these things open brand new doors, all really positioned well for open source. So I really hope you enjoyed this week's conversation with Andy Billington from Rail Baltica, and please be looking out for more episodes of Running on OCP in the coming weeks. Thanks for listening, and cheers.